At 3:42 a.m. on February 17, 1970, dispatchers at Fort Bragg received an emergency phone call. A man's voice, faint and desperate, spoke into the receiver. "Help! 544 Castle Drive! Stabbing! 544 Castle Drive! Stabbing! Hurry!" Then the sound of the receiver clattering against a wall. The line went dead. Within 10 minutes, responding military police arrived at the address, initially believing they were responding to a domestic disturbance. They found the front door closed and locked, the house dark inside. When no one answered, they circled to the back. What they discovered inside would become one of America's most shocking and controversial murder cases. They found 26-year-old Colette McDonald and her daughters, 5-year-old Kimberly and 2-year-old Kristen, brutally murdered in their bedrooms. And lying unconscious next to his wife's body was Captain Jeffrey McDonald, a Green Beret surgeon who claimed 4 intruders had destroyed his family. McDonald told investigators he had been attacked by 3 men and a woman carrying a flickering light, wearing a floppy hat, who chanted, "Acid is groovy, kill the pigs." It sounded like a nightmare from the era of Charles Manson and hippie violence. But 9 years later, Jeffrey McDonald would be convicted of murdering his own family. The question that has haunted investigators, juries, and the American public for over 50 years. Was Jeffrey McDonald a loving father and husband whose family was slaughtered by drug-crazed killers? Or was he a calculating killer who staged one of the most elaborate cover-ups in criminal history? I'm your host, and today we're diving deep into one of America's most controversial murder cases. A story that spans 5 decades, involves the elite Green Berets, and asks the ultimate question: can a loving father and husband become a killer in a single moment of rage? This case contains graphic descriptions of violence. Viewer discretion is advised. To understand what happened on that February night in 1970, we need to go back to the beginning, to a love story that started in the hallways of a Long Island high S. Jeffrey Robert McDonald was born on October 12, 1943, in Jamaica, Queens, but raised in the working-class community of Patchogue, Long Island. His father, Robert, was a disciplinarian who demanded excellence, while his mother, Dorothy, provided the emotional warmth that balanced their household. At Patchogue High School, Jeffrey McDonald was everything parents dreamed their sons could be. He was voted most popular and most likely to succeed by his classmates, served as student council president, and was even crowned king of the senior prom. But it was in 8th grade that he first noticed a shy, pretty girl walking down the hallway with her best friend. Her name was Colette Catherine Stevenson, born May 10, 1943, just 5 months after Jeffrey. Where Jeffrey was outgoing and confident, Colette was quiet and thoughtful, what Jeffrey would later describe as having a slight fear of the world in general that he found endearing. He gradually began to see himself as her protector. Jeffrey's academic achievements earned him a 3-year scholarship to Princeton University, where he enrolled as a pre-medical student in 1962. Even separated by distance, with Colette attending Skidmore College in upstate New York, their relationship endured. Jeffrey would frequently hitchhike the hours-long journey to see her on weekends, and they exchanged letters constantly. But their fairy tale took an unexpected turn in 1963, during their sophomore year. When Colette discovered she was pregnant, the young couple made a decision that would shape the rest of their lives. On September 14, 1963, Jeffrey McDonald and Colette Stevenson were married in New York City. 100 guests attended the ceremony at the Fifth Avenue Hotel, followed by a honeymoon at Cape Cod. 7 months later, on April 18, 1964, their first daughter was born at Princeton Hospital. They named her Kimberly Catherine McDonald. Jeffrey later described his first child as reserved and less outgoing than her younger sister would become, a bright student and loving, gentle child who loved to read and draw. In 1965, the young family moved to Chicago, where Jeffrey had been accepted to Northwestern University Medical School. They squeezed into a tiny 1-bedroom apartment, with Colette committed to raising their daughter while Jeffrey focused on his demanding studies. To make ends meet, Jeffrey worked a series of part-time jobs while maintaining his academic excellence. The family's circumstances gradually improved, and they moved to a middle-class neighborhood. On May 8, 1967, their second daughter was born. They named her Kristen Jean McDonald. If Kimberly was the studious, reserved child, Kristen was her opposite, bold, fearless, and fiercely protective of her older sister. Jeffrey would later recall how, if Kimberly got pushed around by other kids, Kristen would run over and crack someone. When investigators finally tracked down Helena Stokely, her statements were contradictory and unreliable. Sometimes she claimed to remember being at the McDonald home that night. Other times she insisted she had no memory due to her extensive drug use. The one consistency in her story was that she couldn't be trusted to tell the truth. After 6 weeks of testimony and investigation, Colonel Warren Rock delivered his shocking conclusion on October 13, 1970. He recommended that all charges against McDonald be dismissed, stating there was insufficient evidence to prove his guilt and that he believed no truth existed in the charges. Rock went further, suggesting that civilian authorities should investigate Helena Stokely as a potential suspect. In December 1970, Jeffrey McDonald received an honorable discharge from the Army and left Fort Bragg, moving first to New York and then to California to rebuild his life. For most people, this would have been the end of the story. But for one man, it was just the beginning of a crusade that would change everything. Just when police thought they had their answer, a new piece of evidence emerged that would shatter Jeffrey McDonald's world forever. February 16, 1970, was a Monday, what seemed like just another routine day in the life of the McDonald family. The day began normally enough. Jeffrey took his daughters to feed and ride the Christmas pony he had bought them just 2 months earlier. The trio returned home around 5:45 p.m., where they cleaned up for dinner. It was a typical family evening, the kind they'd shared hundreds of times before. After their family meal, Colette left the house around 7 p.m. to attend her evening child psychology class at the North Carolina University Extension on Fort Bragg. This was part of her pursuit of that English literature degree, a dream she'd put on hold to support Jeffrey through medical school. Jeffrey stayed home with the girls, playing their favorite game where he would get down on all fours and let them ride on his back like a pony. Around 7 p.m., Jeffrey put 2-year-old Kristen to bed. Then he took a brief nap while 5-year-old Kimberly played quietly in the living room. When he woke up an hour later, he watched television with Kimberly, specifically her favorite show, Laugh-In, before putting her to bed as well. Colette returned home at 9:40 p.m. The couple settled on the couch together, watching The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson. Everything was peaceful. Everything was normal. Jeffrey would later remember this as quality time. Just him and his pregnant wife, relaxing together after a busy day. Sometime during the middle of Johnny Carson's monologue, Colette decided she was tired. She headed to their bedroom to sleep. Jeffrey stayed in the living room, continuing to watch television. At some point, he dozed off on the couch. What happened in the next few hours would change American criminal history forever. At exactly 3:42 a.m. on February 17, 1970, the Fort Bragg dispatcher received that desperate call we heard at the beginning. "Help! 544 Castle Drive. Stabbing! Hurry!" Military Police Sergeant Kenneth Micah was among the first responders racing toward Castle Drive. As he drove through the empty base, he passed something unusual: a woman walking alone in the rain. In 1970, it was extremely rare to see any civilian woman alone on a military base at nearly 4 a.m., much less during a rainstorm. Sergeant Micah would later describe the woman as having long blonde hair, or possibly a wig, wearing a large floppy hat and knee-high boots. She appeared to be carrying something that flickered like a candle. The woman was walking along a route that would take her away from Castle Drive. Micah noted her presence but continued to the emergency call, telling his lieutenant to send a car to investigate. No car was ever sent. When Sergeant Micah stepped inside, he immediately knew this was no domestic disturbance. Walking toward the master bedroom, what he found would haunt him for the rest of his life. Lying on the blood-covered floor between the master bed and a closet was 26-year-old Colette McDonald. She had been both bludgeoned and stabbed. Her wounds were devastating. Someone had struck her head with such force that her skull was fractured. She had also been stabbed 16 times with an ice pick and 21 times with knives. Next to Colette's body lay her husband, Captain Jeffrey MacDonald. He was unconscious but alive, suffering from what appeared to be multiple stab wounds. Most were superficial, but one had punctured his lung and was potentially life-threatening. In the bedrooms nearby, the scene was even more horrific. 5-year-old Kimberly was found in her bed, having been bludgeoned with such force that her skull was fractured. She had also been stabbed with a knife. Her injuries suggested she had tried to defend herself or someone else. 2-year-old Kristen was discovered in her bedroom, stabbed repeatedly in the heart and chest with both a knife and an ice pick. The violence inflicted on this toddler was beyond comprehension. As paramedics worked to revive Jeffrey MacDonald, Sergeant Micah leaned down and asked the question that would launch one of the most controversial investigations in American history. Who did this? MacDonald's answer seemed to come straight from the era's worst nightmares. He claimed that 4 intruders had attacked his family, 3 men and 1 woman. The woman, he said, had long blonde hair and was wearing a floppy hat and boots. She carried a flickering candle and chanted words that would become infamous. "Acid is groovy. Kill the pigs." The phrase was eerily similar to graffiti found at Charles Manson murder scenes just 6 months earlier in California. The timing couldn't have been more significant. The Manson family's brutal killings of Sharon Tate and others had terrorized the nation, and their trial was dominating headlines in early 1970. MacDonald told investigators that he had fallen asleep on the living room couch while watching television. He was awakened by his wife and daughter. MacDonald's answer seemed to come straight from the era's worst nightmares. He claimed that 4 intruders had attacked his family, 3 men and 1 woman. The woman, he said, had long blonde hair and was wearing a floppy hat and boots. She carried a flickering candle and chanted words that would become infamous. "Acid is groovy. Kill the pigs." The phrase was eerily similar to graffiti found at Charles Manson murder scenes just 6 months earlier in California. The timing couldn't have been more significant. The Manson family's brutal killings of Sharon Tate and others had terrorized the nation, and their trial was dominating headlines in early 1970. MacDonald told investigators that he had fallen asleep on the living room couch while watching television. He was awakened by his wife and daughter screaming. When he tried to help them, the intruders attacked him with a baseball bat and knives. After a struggle, he lost consciousness. When he came to, his family was dead. But investigators almost immediately noticed something troubling. Lying on the living room floor, near where MacDonald claimed he had been attacked, was a copy of Esquire magazine. It was open to an article about the Charles Manson murders, the very crimes that MacDonald's story seemed to mimic. Even more puzzling was the physical evidence. Each member of the MacDonald family had a different blood type, a statistical anomaly that would prove crucial to the investigation. Jeffrey's blood was found almost nowhere in the house except in the bathroom. Meanwhile, his injuries, though serious, were far less severe than those inflicted on his wife and children. Jeffrey was rushed to Womack Army Hospital, where he was treated for a punctured lung and multiple stab wounds. He spent 9 days in intensive care, during which time investigators began to develop a theory that would shock the military community. The investigation that followed would uncover secrets that no one, not Jeffrey's friends, not his commanding officers, not even his own family, could have imagined. Because as investigators began to piece together the physical evidence from that blood-soaked apartment, a very different story began to emerge. A story that would suggest the real killer hadn't broken into the MacDonald home at all. He had been living there all along. The scene that greeted investigators at 544 Castle Drive on the morning of February 17, 1970, would become a textbook example of how not to handle a crime scene. What should have been a controlled, methodical investigation quickly descended into chaos. By 9 a.m., there were 12 to 13 people inside the small apartment. Military police, medics, CID investigators, and medical personnel from Womack Army Hospital. Each person potentially contaminated crucial evidence. While Jeffrey MacDonald was being treated at the hospital, investigators documented what they found inside 544 Castle Drive. The living room showed signs of what appeared to be a struggle. A coffee table was overturned, lying on top of a stack of magazines. A flower pot had been knocked over, its contents spilled across the floor, but it was the physical evidence that would prove most telling. CID agent Robert Shaw, dispatched to investigate the crime scene, made several crucial discoveries. Outside the back door, near the utility room, he found what appeared to be the murder weapons: an old Hickory brand steel paring knife, an ice pick, and a blood-stained piece of wood approximately 31 inches long, later determined to be a club made from a bed slat. Inside the master bedroom, investigators found Jeffrey's blue pajama top, torn down the left front seam and sleeve, with 48 puncture holes. Strangely, the pajama top had been placed over Colette's body. MacDonald claimed he had used it to ward off his attackers and then to cover his wife, but investigators found this puzzling. Why would someone in shock from discovering his murdered family take time to arrange a garment over the body? The blood evidence told an even more complex story. Remember, each family member had a different blood type. Jeffrey was type B, Colette was type A, Kimberly was type AB, and Kristen was type O. This rare statistical occurrence would prove to be investigators' most powerful tool in reconstructing what really happened that night. Jeffrey's injuries were carefully documented at Womack Army Hospital. He had suffered a punctured lung from a stab wound to the chest, multiple superficial cuts, and what appeared to be blunt force trauma. But investigators noted something odd. For someone who claimed to have fought desperately against 4 armed attackers, his injuries seemed remarkably minor compared to the devastation inflicted on his family. But even as investigators tried to piece together the puzzle, the crime scene was being compromised. A medic, trying to be helpful, had uprighted the fallen flower pot and even sat on the couch where MacDonald claimed to have been sleeping. Military police assigned to guard the perimeter had allowed the household garbage to be emptied before it could be examined. Fingerprints weren't taken from the children's bodies, and those taken from Colette were incomplete. Dr. George Gamble, the pathologist at Womack Army Hospital, conducted the autopsies on February 17th. His findings painted a picture of extreme violence. Colette had been struck in the head with such force that her skull was fractured in multiple places. She had defensive wounds on her arms, suggesting she had tried to fight off her attacker. The children's injuries were equally brutal. Both had suffered devastating head trauma in addition to multiple stab wounds. As the Army's Criminal Investigation Division began analyzing the evidence, they discovered what they considered to be serious inconsistencies in MacDonald's account. The living room, where he claimed a violent struggle had taken place between him and 4 attackers, showed remarkably little damage. The magazines stacked under the overturned coffee table were neatly arranged, and a greeting card was still standing upright on a nearby surface. Investigators found a bloody footprint on the floor, but their attempts to preserve it resulted in the evidence being destroyed when the wooden floorboards separated during removal. A vial containing a blue fiber found under Kristen's fingernail was lost, along with a piece of skin found under Colette's fingernail. The investigation was plagued by these kinds of evidence handling problems from the very beginning. One discovery that particularly intrigued investigators was the contents of the MacDonald family's linen closet. Inside, they found an extensive collection of medical supplies, 70 different medications, at least 14 disposable hypodermic syringes, and 8 boxes of hypodermic needles. For a family with young children, it seemed like an unusual amount of pharmaceutical supplies. Even news of the murders sent shockwaves through the Fort Bragg community and beyond. A Green Beret captain's family had been slaughtered in what appeared to be a Manson-style attack. The idea that drug-crazed hippies could penetrate a secure military installation and commit such violence terrified military families and the surrounding civilian community. As Jeffrey recovered in the hospital, he provided investigators with increasingly detailed accounts of the attack. He described the female intruder as having long blonde hair, possibly a wig, wearing a floppy hat, knee-high boots, and dark clothing. She held a flickering candle and chanted about acid and killing pigs. The 3 male attackers included 1 black man and 2 white men, one of whom wore an Army field jacket. But investigators were about to discover something that changed everything about their understanding of this case. Within hours of the murders, Fayetteville Police Detective Prince Beasley heard McDonald's description of the intruders being broadcast over police radio. One detail immediately caught his attention: the female suspect with long blonde hair and a floppy hat. Beasley knew someone who fit that exact description. Her name was Helena Stokely, and she was Prince Beasley's confidential informant in Fayetteville's small but active drug community. The 17-year-old was known to police as a troubled young woman from a military family who had fallen into heavy drug use and was living on the fringes of society. Helena's story was both tragic and eerily familiar to anyone following the counterculture movement of the late 1960s. She had been raised in a structured military household. Her father was a retired Army colonel. But during her senior year of high school, she had begun frequenting a pizza parlor in Fayetteville's Haymount section that was known as a hangout for drug dealers and users. According to her younger brother Gene, Helena had once been a bright, talented young woman who took singing lessons from a member of the Fayetteville Symphony and showed promise as both a vocalist and piano player. But by 1970, she was using heroin 8 to 9 times a day, along with a dangerous mix of other drugs including mescaline, LSD, and amphetamines. Detective Beasley had been using Helena as an informant to gather information about drug activity in the Fayetteville area. She was exactly the kind of person who would know about planned drug-related crimes, robberies, or violence in the community. When Beasley heard McDonald's description over the radio, he immediately thought of Helena. Beasley called CID, the Army's investigative division, to inform them that he might have identified one of the suspects. But incredibly, no one from CID ever responded to his call. This would become a pattern throughout the early investigation. Military investigators seemed more focused on building a case against Jeffrey McDonald than pursuing other potential suspects. The night after the murders, Beasley decided to stake out Helena's residence on his own. Around 2 a.m., he watched as she drove up with several men who matched McDonald's descriptions of the male intruders, including one black man and 2 white men, one wearing what appeared to be military clothing. Beasley approached Helena directly and asked her point blank, "I know you've heard about the murders out at Fort Bragg. The descriptions fit you people perfectly. Were you there? Answer yes or no." According to Beasley, Helena told him that she was on drugs that night, but yes, she thought she was there. Helena wasn't alone in her drug-fueled lifestyle. She was part of a loose group of young people who regularly used drugs together and sometimes engaged in petty crimes to support their habits. Central to this group was Helena's on and off boyfriend, Gregory Mitchell, a Vietnam veteran who had developed a heroin addiction while serving overseas. Mitchell's background was both compelling and troubling. He had served his country in Vietnam but returned home damaged, both physically and psychologically. Like many veterans of that era, he struggled to readjust to civilian life and had turned to drugs to cope with his experiences. By 1970, he was using heroin regularly and was known to associate with other drug users in the Fayetteville area. Other members of Helena's circle included individuals with extensive drug histories and criminal records. There was Don Harris, Dwight Smith, Kathy Perry, Bruce Fowler, and Alan Mazarole, a collection of young people who had dropped out of mainstream society and were living day to day, often committing crimes to support their drug habits. Despite this promising lead, military investigators showed little interest in pursuing Helena Stokely and her associates. Instead, by April 1970, they had become convinced that Jeffrey McDonald himself was the killer. On April 6th, McDonald was relieved of his duties and placed under restriction pending further investigation. The Army formally charged McDonald with 3 counts of murder on May 1, 1970. An Article 32 hearing, the military equivalent of a preliminary hearing, was convened on July 6th under the oversight of Colonel Warren Rock. For the next 6 weeks, investigators and attorneys would examine every piece of evidence in the case. The Article 32 hearing revealed the full scope of the military's investigation problems. It became clear that investigators had done virtually no follow-up on Helena Stokely or her associates. They hadn't checked utility bills, phone records, or rental agreements that might have helped identify her companions that night. They hadn't even tried to locate her after the initial contact with Detective Beasley. McDonald's civilian defense attorney, Bernard Siegel, was astounded by the Army's incompetence. During cross-examination, he systematically exposed how investigators had focused exclusively on building a case against McDonald while ignoring potentially exonerating evidence. One of the most damaging revelations was that MP Kenneth Micah, who had seen the woman matching Helena's description near the McDonald home on the night of the murders, had been ordered not to mention this sighting during the hearing. This crucial piece of evidence, which corroborated McDonald's account of a female intruder, was deliberately suppressed by investigators. By 1971, Jeffrey McDonald appeared to have escaped justice. He was living in a luxury beachfront condominium in Long Beach, California, working as an emergency room physician, driving a Mercedes, and enjoying life on his 34-foot yacht. But 3,000 miles away, someone was meticulously studying every page of the Army's investigation. Freddie Kassab had been Jeffrey McDonald's most vocal supporter throughout the Army investigation. As Colette's stepfather, he had publicly defended McDonald and even criticized the military investigators for their incompetence. But something had changed. As Kassab read through the 2,000-page transcript of the Article 32 hearing, he began to notice troubling inconsistencies in McDonald's various accounts of that night. In March 1971, Kassab visited the McDonald apartment at 544 Castle Drive, which had been preserved as a crime scene. What he observed there would convince him that Jeffrey McDonald was lying. The physical evidence simply didn't support McDonald's claims of a violent struggle with 4 intruders. While Kassab was developing his suspicions, federal investigators were conducting the most detailed forensic analysis in criminal history up to that point. What they discovered in the FBI's crime lab would provide the breakthrough that investigators had been seeking, but it wouldn't be DNA or fingerprints. It would be something far more damning, the story told by Jeffrey McDonald's own pajama top. FBI textile expert Paul Stombaugh began his analysis of McDonald's blue pajama top in 1971. The garment had been torn down the left front seam and left sleeve, and it contained 48 puncture holes, far more than the 4 wounds McDonald had sustained. But when Stombaugh began his meticulous examination, he made a discovery that would change everything. Using a light box and the naked eye, Stombaugh found 4 type A blood stains, Colette's blood, that had been torn through when the pajama top was ripped. This meant that Colette's blood was on Jeffrey's pajama top before it was torn, contradicting McDonald's claim that the garment was damaged during his struggle with the intruders and then used to cover his wife's body. FBI physical science technician Shirley Green then conducted an even more extraordinary experiment. She attempted to align the 48 puncture holes in the pajama top with the 21 ice pick wounds in Colette's chest. Working with graph paper, push pins, and steel rods, Green made a stunning discovery. All 48 holes in the pajama top could be perfectly aligned with Colette's 21 wounds if the garment was folded and placed on her chest, exactly as it was found at the crime scene. Each puncture was round and smooth, indicating the garment was stationary when the wounds were inflicted. This meant someone had placed the pajama top on Colette's body and then stabbed her through it with an ice pick. The blood evidence told an even more devastating story. Remember, each family member had a different blood type, creating what investigators called a virtual map of everyone's movements that night. Jeffrey's type B blood was found in only 2 significant locations, in front of the kitchen cabinet and in the hallway bathroom. Yet his blood was virtually absent from the living room where he claimed to have been attacked. The fiber evidence was equally damning. 81 fibers from Jeffrey's pajama top were found throughout the house, in the master bedroom, in both children's bedrooms, and on the murder weapon itself. But not a single fiber was found in the living room, where McDonald claimed his pajama top had been torn during the struggle with intruders. Most shocking of all, investigators found Kimberly's type AB blood on Jeffrey's pajama top, even though he claimed he wasn't wearing the garment when he discovered her body. They also found evidence that Kimberly had been in the master bedroom when she was initially attacked, not in her own bedroom as MacDonald claimed. Armed with this devastating forensic evidence, federal prosecutors presented the case to a grand jury in January 1975. After hearing testimony from dozens of witnesses and examining hundreds of pieces of evidence, the grand jury returned an indictment charging Jeffrey MacDonald with 3 counts of murder. On January 24, 1975, nearly 5 years after the murders, Jeffrey MacDonald was arrested at his California hospital. The man who thought he had escaped justice was about to face the most damning physical evidence case in American criminal history. This discovery would lead police directly to a truth more horrifying than anyone could have imagined, that Jeffrey MacDonald hadn't been the victim of the violence at 544 Castle Drive. He had been its architect. As prosecutors prepared for trial, they faced a fundamental question. What could drive a successful doctor, a decorated Green Beret, and an apparently loving father to brutally murder his pregnant wife and 2 young daughters? On the surface, Jeffrey MacDonald appeared to be the embodiment of the American dream. He was a Princeton graduate, a Northwestern-trained physician, and a captain in the Army's most elite unit. He was handsome, charismatic, and seemingly devoted to his family. But beneath this perfect exterior, investigators began to uncover a more complex and troubling picture. Court-appointed psychologists who examined MacDonald after his arrest made disturbing observations. They found an extraordinary absence of anxiety, depression, and anger regarding the loss of his family. One expert concluded that MacDonald was able to muster massive denial or repression to such a degree that the impact of his family's deaths had been blunted. He presented himself as victimized and somewhat of a martyr. Author Joe McGinnis, who spent extensive time with MacDonald while writing Fatal Vision, came to believe that MacDonald was a narcissistic sociopath who was capable of extreme violence when his self-image was threatened. McGinnis observed that MacDonald seemed more concerned with how others perceived him than with grieving for his murdered family. Despite MacDonald's claims that his marriage was perfect, investigators uncovered evidence of growing stress within the MacDonald household. Colette's mother testified that her daughter had been struggling with Jeffrey's demanding schedule and lack of help with the children. There were hints of extramarital affairs and financial pressures that contradicted the image of domestic bliss MacDonald had carefully constructed. Those who knew MacDonald described him as someone who needed to be in control at all times. He was described as extremely dependent on what others thought of him, and someone who would launch into verbal tirades when his authority was questioned. His need for perfection and control extended to every aspect of his life: his physical appearance, his career, and his public image. The night before the murders, Colette had attended her child psychology class, where she asked the instructor what to do about a child who frequently climbed into bed with her parents. Investigators found evidence of urine on the master bedroom bedsheet, specifically Kimberly's urine. The prosecution would theorize that the murders began with an argument over bedwetting that escalated beyond anyone's imagination. The pressure on MacDonald to maintain his perfect image was immense. He was a Green Beret officer with plans to attend Yale for advanced medical training. He had a pregnant wife, 2 young daughters, and the weight of expectations from his family and military superiors. For someone with his psychological makeup, any threat to this carefully constructed image could trigger a catastrophic response. Experts in family violence point out that family annihilators often appear to be model citizens on the surface. They're typically men who have invested heavily in maintaining a public image of success and control. When that image is threatened by financial problems, marital discord, or loss of status, they may choose to destroy their family rather than face public humiliation. MacDonald's behavior in the days and weeks following the murders raised red flags for investigators. He showed little obvious grief, quickly began dating other women, and seemed more concerned with defending his reputation than mourning his family. When he appeared on The Dick Cavett Show, in December 1970, his casual demeanor shocked viewers and further convinced investigators of his guilt. The staging of the crime scene revealed a calculating intelligence at work. The Esquire magazine opened to the Manson article, the word pig written in blood on the headboard, the minimal damage to the living room despite claims of a violent struggle, all suggested someone with the medical knowledge and emotional detachment to methodically arrange a scene while his family lay dead around him. The discovery of a surgical glove fragment in the master bedroom bedding was particularly telling. MacDonald had extensive medical training and access to surgical supplies. Investigators theorized that he had worn gloves during the murders to avoid leaving fingerprints, but one glove had torn during the violent attack on his family. The forensic evidence suggested that MacDonald had moved methodically through the house that night, attacking each family member separately, and then returning to stage the scene. The blood and fiber evidence indicated he had carried his daughter's bodies, rearranged bedding, and carefully placed evidence to support his intruder story, all while maintaining enough control to inflict only superficial wounds on himself. FBI behavioral analysts who studied the case concluded that the perpetrator was someone with intimate knowledge of the family's routines, access to the house, and the emotional coldness to carry out such violence against people he claimed to love. The killer was organized, intelligent, and capable of elaborate deception, characteristics that perfectly matched Jeffrey MacDonald's profile. But catching the man behind this elaborate deception would prove more difficult than anyone imagined. MacDonald wasn't just fighting for his freedom, he was fighting for the carefully constructed image that had defined his entire life. And he would use every resource at his disposal, including his considerable charm and intelligence, to convince a jury that he was the victim rather than the perpetrator of this horrific crime. The stage was now set for one of the most compelling murder trials in American history, a battle between devastating physical evidence and the persuasive power of a man who had spent his entire life convincing people he was someone he wasn't. By 1972, Jeffrey MacDonald thought he had escaped forever. Living the high life in Long Beach, California, he had transformed himself from accused murderer to respected emergency room physician. But 3,000 miles away, the wheels of justice were slowly grinding toward him. In June 1972, the Army's Criminal Investigation Division delivered a massive 13-volume report to the Justice Department, recommending that Jeffrey MacDonald be prosecuted for the murders of his family. The report contained the results of 699 interviews, detailed forensic analysis, and what investigators considered overwhelming evidence of MacDonald's guilt. But federal prosecutors weren't rushing to judgment. The case had already been botched once by the military, and they knew they would get only one chance to convict MacDonald in civilian court. Justice Department attorneys spent months reviewing every piece of evidence, every witness statement, every forensic detail. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source. On April 30th, 1974, Freddie Kassab, Colette's stepfather who had become convinced of MacDonald's guilt, filed a citizen's complaint with federal prosecutors. Standing beside him was CID agent Peter Kearns and attorney Richard Kahn. Their message was simple. If the Justice Department wouldn't act, they would take their case to the public. What MacDonald didn't know was that federal agents had been quietly monitoring him since 1972. They tracked his movements, his finances, his relationships. They wanted to be absolutely certain he wouldn't flee when the indictment came down. MacDonald had built a new life in California. He was the director of emergency medicine at a major hospital, owned a luxury condo, drove a Mercedes, and had a 34-foot yacht. He had everything to lose. Throughout this period, MacDonald repeatedly contacted federal authorities, offering to cooperate with their investigation. From January 1972 through January 1974, he sent letters through his attorneys, requesting that the government complete its investigation and offering to submit to interviews. The Justice Department declined to question him, keeping him in suspense about their intentions. On August 12, 1974, federal prosecutors finally felt ready to act. A grand jury was convened in Raleigh, North Carolina, to hear evidence in the MacDonald case. For the next 5 months, 75 witnesses would testify about what happened at 544 Castle Drive on February 17, 1970. Jeffrey McDonald was the first witness called before the grand jury. Over 5 days of testimony, he maintained his innocence, but prosecutors noted his arrogant and sarcastic demeanor when questioned about inconsistencies in his story. When asked about extramarital affairs, McDonald became defensive. When questioned about forensic evidence that contradicted his account, he snapped at prosecutors, shouting, "I have no idea. I don't even know what crap you're trying to feed me." McDonald also refused to discuss the results of a polygraph test he had taken in 1970, claiming he needed to speak with his attorney first. This refusal to cooperate fully with the investigation did not go unnoticed by federal prosecutors, who were building not just a legal case, but a psychological profile of their suspect. As 1974 turned to 1975, federal authorities knew the grand jury was close to reaching a decision. They began coordinating with California law enforcement for McDonald's inevitable arrest. The plan was simple but crucial. The moment the grand jury returned an indictment, McDonald had to be taken into custody before he could flee. On January 21, 1975, McDonald was recalled for his final appearance before the grand jury. This time, his arrogance was on full display. He was combative, dismissive, and showed little of the grief one would expect from a man who had lost his entire family. Federal prosecutors watched his performance with growing confidence that they had their killer. 3 days later, the grand jury reached its decision. After reviewing thousands of pages of evidence, crime scene photographs, forensic reports, and witness testimony, they concluded that Jeffrey McDonald had murdered his pregnant wife and 2 young daughters. Police were closing in, but the suspect had one more surprise that would test the American justice system to its limits. January 24, 1975, started like any other day for Jeffrey McDonald. He arrived at St. Mary Medical Center in Long Beach for his shift as Director of Emergency Medicine, unaware that 3,000 miles away, a grand jury was about to change his life forever. At 2:47 p.m. Eastern Time, the grand jury foreman stood and read the indictment. The United States of America versus Jeffrey R. McDonald. 3 counts of murder, 1 count for each member of his family. Within minutes, FBI agents in California received the arrest order. Their target was at work, treating patients in one of the busiest emergency rooms on the West Coast. The irony was not lost on investigators. A man who had dedicated his life to saving others was about to be arrested for the most heinous crime imaginable. Federal agents arrived at St. Mary Medical Center within the hour. They waited outside the emergency department, knowing McDonald's shift wouldn't end until evening. They couldn't risk creating a scene in a hospital full of patients, but they also couldn't let McDonald slip away. Inside the emergency room, Jeffrey McDonald continued his work, treating car accident victims and heart attack patients with the same skill and dedication that had made him a respected physician. His colleagues later said he showed no signs of stress or unusual behavior that day. At 6:15 p.m. Pacific Time, McDonald walked out of the hospital toward his Mercedes in the parking lot. Federal agents approached him calmly and professionally. "Dr. McDonald, I'm Special Agent Roberts, FBI. You're under arrest for the murders of Colette, Kimberly, and Kristen McDonald." McDonald's reaction was described by agents as one of shock, followed quickly by indignation. He demanded to speak with his attorney and maintained his innocence, but he did not resist arrest. The man who had presented himself as a victim for nearly 5 years was finally being held accountable for his crimes. McDonald was transported to the federal courthouse in Los Angeles for processing. News of his arrest spread quickly. The Green Beret doctor who claimed hippie intruders had killed his family was now charged with the murders himself. The case that had fascinated the public for years was about to become even more sensational. Within a week, McDonald's friends and colleagues had raised $100,000 for his bail. On January 31, 1975, he was released pending trial, but with strict conditions. He couldn't leave California without permission, and he had to surrender his passport. The jet-setting lifestyle was over. McDonald immediately assembled a high-powered legal team led by Bernard Sagal, the same attorney who had represented him during the Army investigation. Their strategy was simple but audacious: portray MacDonald as the victim of a rush to judgment and convince a jury that the real killers were still out there. But MacDonald's legal troubles were just beginning. His attorneys filed motion after motion, claiming violations of his constitutional rights. They argued that the 5-year delay between the murders and the indictment violated his right to a speedy trial. For a time, it looked like they might succeed. In January 1976, the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals agreed with MacDonald's attorneys and dismissed the indictment on speedy trial grounds. MacDonald claimed to weep tears of relief rather than tears of joy and returned to what he called a big celebration, believing his ordeal was finally over. But federal prosecutors weren't finished. They appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, arguing that MacDonald's constitutional rights had not been violated. The case became a landmark legal precedent about speedy trial rights and the relationship between military and civilian justice. On March 31, 1982, the Supreme Court ruled 6-3 that MacDonald's speedy trial rights had not been violated. The justices determined that the time between the dismissal of military charges and the federal indictment should not count against the government. Jeffrey MacDonald would face trial for murder. MacDonald was rearrested and returned to federal custody. The man who had enjoyed 7 years of freedom while his case wound through the appeals process was finally going to face a jury of his peers. But this wouldn't be just any trial. It would be a battle between the most sophisticated forensic evidence ever assembled and one of the most charismatic defendants in American criminal history. The trial that followed would reveal even more shocking details about what really happened at 544 Castle Drive and would force a jury to answer the ultimate question: was Jeffrey MacDonald a loving father, driven to madness by tragedy, or a calculating killer who had fooled everyone for nearly a decade? The stage was set for a legal battle that would captivate the nation and ultimately determine whether one of America's most notorious murder cases would finally see justice served. On July 16, 1979, nearly 9.5 years after the murders, Jeffrey MacDonald finally faced a jury of his peers in federal court in Raleigh, North Carolina. The man who had once been viewed as a victim was now the defendant in one of the most complex murder trials in American history. From the moment the trial began, it was clear this would be unlike any murder case the American public had ever witnessed. The prosecution team, led by James Blackburn and Brian Murtaugh, arrived armed with over 1,100 pieces of evidence, the most comprehensive forensic case ever assembled at that time. But what prosecutors didn't expect was how compelling Jeffrey MacDonald would be on the witness stand. For 2 days, MacDonald testified in his own defense, presenting himself as a grieving father and husband who had been victimized twice, first by murderous intruders, then by an incompetent investigation. Under gentle questioning from defense attorney Bernard Siegel, MacDonald painted a picture of domestic bliss. He described his final evening with Colette, playing horsey with his daughters, the quiet family dinner, watching television together. His voice broke as he recounted discovering their bodies, and several jurors appeared moved by his testimony. But then came the cross-examination that would seal his fate. Prosecutor James Blackburn rose slowly, approached the witness stand, and began a methodical destruction of MacDonald's carefully constructed facade. "Dr. MacDonald," Blackburn began, his voice measured and deliberate, "if the jury should find from the evidence that your blood was found in the kitchen, but you testified you only went as far as the telephone, do you have any explanation for that? If the jury should find that 48 holes in your pajama top match exactly with 21 wounds in your wife's chest when the garment is folded, do you have any explanation for that?" MacDonald's answers became increasingly evasive. "No," he would say, or "just pure conjecture." The most devastating moment came when Blackburn asked about the fibers from MacDonald's pajama top found throughout the house. "Dr. MacDonald, if the jury finds that 81 fibers from your pajama top were found in every room where your family was murdered, but not a single fiber was found in the living room where you claim to have been attacked, do you have any explanation for that?" MacDonald's mask finally slipped, The confident, grieving father was replaced by an arrogant man who clearly believed himself smarter than everyone else. When Blackburn pressed him about inconsistencies in his story, MacDonald snapped, "I have no idea. I don't even know what crap you're trying to feed me." The jury had seen the real Jeffrey MacDonald, not a victim, but a man whose narcissistic rage had been triggered by being challenged. In that moment, many observers later said the case was over. In closing arguments, prosecutor James Blackburn made a prediction that would prove chillingly accurate. Although we are convinced that MacDonald is guilty, we only wish he was not, given the final moments of the victims and who it was that was going to make them die. The defendant will never have peace. On August 29, 1979, after 6.5 hours of deliberation, the jury reached their verdict. As they filed back into the packed courtroom, the tension was electric. MacDonald sat stoically between his attorneys, his mother clutching her rosary in the gallery behind him. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Jeffrey R. MacDonald, guilty of murder in the first degree in the death of Kristen MacDonald." A gasp went through the courtroom. "We find the defendant guilty of murder in the second degree in the death of Colette MacDonald." "We find the defendant guilty of murder in the second degree in the death of Kimberly MacDonald." 4 jurors wept openly as they announced their verdicts. MacDonald's mother, Dorothy, rushed from the courtroom sobbing. But Jeffrey MacDonald himself displayed no emotion whatsoever, a reaction that observers found chillingly consistent with the psychological profile prosecutors had painted. Judge Franklin Dupree wasted no time. "The court sentences you to 3 terms of life imprisonment to be served consecutively." MacDonald was immediately handcuffed and led away to begin what would effectively be the rest of his life behind bars. But the most powerful moment came not in the courtroom, but in a phone call made immediately after the verdict. Freddie Kassab, Colette's stepfather, who had fought for 9 years to see this day, called the family's attorney with 4 simple words that summed up nearly a decade of pain and perseverance. "I just got what I wanted." The conviction of Jeffrey MacDonald sent shockwaves through both the military and medical communities. How could someone so respected, so accomplished, so trusted, commit such horrific crimes against his own family? For the families involved, the verdict brought both relief and lasting pain. Mildred Kassab, Colette's mother, told reporters, "We didn't want Jeff to be guilty. We wanted the real killers caught. But when the evidence showed he did it, we had to accept that truth, no matter how painful." The impact on the Fort Bragg community was profound. Fellow Green Berets struggled to understand how one of their own could destroy his family. Dr. Frank Gemma, who had worked with MacDonald at Womack Hospital, said, "We all thought we knew Jeff. The hardest part is realizing we never knew him at all." The case fundamentally changed how crime scenes are investigated, particularly in military settings. The bungled initial response at 544 Castle Drive became the textbook example of what not to do, taught in law enforcement academies worldwide. Colonel William Culbreth, who later taught military police procedures, explained, "The MacDonald case showed us that you preserve a crime scene first, ask questions later. One of the most important jobs of an MP is to protect the evidence for the investigators." The case also revolutionized forensic science. The sophisticated blood analysis, fiber evidence, and crime scene reconstruction techniques pioneered in this case became standard practice in major criminal investigations. Dr. Paul Stombaugh's textile analysis and Shirley Green's pajama top reconstruction opened new frontiers in forensic evidence. Today, similar techniques help solve cases that would have been impossible to prosecute in 1970. Jeffrey MacDonald remains incarcerated at the Federal Correctional Institution in Cumberland, Maryland. Now 81 years old, he has spent more than 4 decades behind bars, longer than his wife and daughters lived combined. He married a second time in 2002 to Catherine Courage, who continues to maintain his innocence and runs a website advocating for his release. MacDonald has never stopped fighting his conviction, filing appeal after appeal and claiming that new evidence proves his innocence. He has had more court hearings than virtually any other convicted murderer in American history. But each appeal has been rejected, with judges consistently finding that the evidence against him is overwhelming. In 2018, the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals issued what many consider the final word on the case, stating, "McDonald has had more time in court than just about any other criminal defendant, but he has failed to produce any evidence that would undermine confidence in his conviction." Colette, Kimberly, and Kristen McDonald are buried together in Washington Memorial Park on Long Island, not far from where Jeffrey first met Colette in high school. Their graves are often visited by people who remember the case, leaving flowers and notes that say simply, "Justice was served." Freddie and Mildred Kassab, who fought tirelessly for justice, both died in 1994. They lived to see McDonald's appeals consistently rejected and died knowing that their daughter's killer would never go free. Perhaps the most important legacy of the McDonald case is how it transformed criminal investigation. The mistakes made in 1970 led to revolutionary changes in evidence collection, crime scene preservation, and forensic analysis that have helped solve thousands of cases since. Today, the first rule taught to every crime scene investigator is, remember McDonald. It means protect the evidence first, because once a crime scene is contaminated, the truth may be lost forever. The sophisticated forensic techniques developed for the McDonald case, blood spatter analysis, fiber comparison, crime scene reconstruction, have become standard tools that help deliver justice for countless families who might otherwise never know what happened to their loved ones. The Jeffrey McDonald case stands as one of the most thoroughly investigated and prosecuted crimes in American history. It took 9 years, but the truth finally emerged from the blood and fibers left behind at 544 Castle Drive. In the end, this case teaches us that the most dangerous predators are often those we trust most. Jeffrey McDonald wasn't a stranger lurking in the shadows. He was a husband and father who destroyed the very people who loved him unconditionally. The case also proves that justice, while sometimes delayed, can ultimately prevail. Physical evidence doesn't lie, and scientific analysis can reveal truth even when human testimony fails. The blood, fibers, and forensic evidence told the real story of what happened that February night, no matter how charismatic or convincing the perpetrator tried to be. Perhaps most importantly, the McDonald case reminds us why we must never stop fighting for victims who can no longer speak for themselves. Colette was 26 years old, working toward her teaching degree and expecting her third child. Kimberly was 5, a bright little girl who loved to read and draw. Kristen was just 2, fearless and protective of her older sister. They deserved so much more than the 26, 5, and 2 years they were given. But because people like Freddie Kassab refused to let their deaths go unavenged, because investigators never stopped pursuing the truth, and because a jury had the courage to convict a charismatic defendant despite his status and credentials, Colette, Kimberly, and Kristen McDonald finally received the justice they deserved. If you found this deep dive into the McDonald case compelling, please hit that like button, subscribe to our channel for more true crime investigations, and let us know in the comments what case you'd like us to examine next. Your support helps us continue telling these important stories and honoring the memories of victims like the McDonald family. Next week, we'll be investigating another case that shocked the nation, the mysterious disappearance of a young mother that led police down a rabbit hole of deception, false identities, and a killer hiding in plain sight. You won't want to miss it. But before we go, let's take a moment to remember Colette, Kimberly, and Kristen McDonald, not for how they died, but for how they lived. They were a mother working toward her dreams, and 2 little girls full of life and potential. Their deaths were a tragedy that shook America, but their memory lives on as a reminder that every victim deserves justice, no matter how long it takes to achieve it. Thank you for joining us for this investigation. Until next time, remember that behind every true crime story are real people who deserve to be remembered, honored, and avenged. This has been The Anatomy of Evil, and we'll see you next week.